o'clock. Thank you everyone for joining our International Thematic Conference on Phonetic Research and Applications, Phonetics 2025 Hong Kong again on 18th September 2025. So first of all, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Janet Fletcher, a renowned linguist from the University of Melbourne, specializing in phonetic theory, prosodic phonology, and acoustic modeling. Her keynote speech is titled Exploring the Phonetics and Phonology in Tahitian. Please join me in welcoming Professor Fletcher. So I'll pass the time to you now, Professor Fletcher. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll just wait for my, so can everyone see my PowerPoint, I hope?
Yeah, very nice.
Great, terrific. Okay, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much to my colleagues for giving me the opportunity to present some of our recent research. So essentially, what I want to talk about today is actually review some of the work that we've been doing on Tahitian, which is an Eastern Polynesian language. But first of all, to sort of give a little bit of a framework for the talk, we know that through the exploration of diverse languages and complex speech sound patterns, we've improved our understanding vastly of phonetic diversity and phonetic typology. But it does seem, and I'm thinking in particular about the languages I've been working on lately, that it's been very hard to find a lot of recent resources on these languages. And it seems that perhaps there's been a tendency to ignore languages with smaller or so-called simple phonological inventories compared to those that are perhaps more unusual and varied compared, in the context of the world's languages and phonetic typology. But of course, we've seen marvelous uplift, I would say, in across the years in people looking more and more at low resource languages. And I would like to point out the recent work that's come out of the Dorico initiative, where very large scale corpora or field data have been analysed in their phonetic context. So thinking now about the corpus I'm going to be talking about today, and I have limited time, so I won't be able to go into huge amounts of detail, but I'm certainly very happy to answer any questions by email or after the talk, whichever is most convenient. But essentially, I'm going to talk about some of the findings from our Tahitian corpus. This corpus was gathered in Papeete, French Polynesia, at the Université de la Polynésie Française just before the pandemic. So lucky us that we got to go there. And the corpus that I'm going to be talking about consists of 2 sentence tasks with controlled lexical materials inserted into 2 separate sentence frames. The first is a variety of disyllabic words that contrast all stops and vowels. And the second task is one where we specifically looked at stress, lexical stress, and very lexical stress location in tokens placed in narrow-focused contexts. We also collected readings of the fable La Bise et le Soleil, the North Wind and the Sun, which for our Tahitian speakers, it made more sense to talk about the southeastern wind and the sun. And we also recorded spontaneous data, but we haven't yet analysed this. We recorded 6 female speakers who are all fluent bilingual speakers of Tahitian and Tahitian French. Now, Tahitian is part of the Eastern Polynesian language family, as I mentioned, and it is spoken in the Eastern Pacific. Now, thinking about the phonological inventory, I should actually back up a bit and mention that it's the dominant Indigenous language of French Polynesia. It has around about 68,000 speakers at the last census. It is, however, undergoing a process of language loss, or should I say the 6 other French Polynesian languages that are spoken in the archipelago have been undergoing severe language loss due to a process of Tahitianization and, of course, prolonged contact with French. It's thought that intergenerational transmission is possibly as low as 23%. So we are really talking about a situation where we're getting generational shift. But essentially, there's been virtually no prior quantitative or experimental phonetic study, but we do have available some descriptions of the phonology available to us. So talking now about the phonology, as you can see, it has a fairly simple in terms of number of phonemes. So we have a single stop series here, labials versus denti-alveolar versus glottal, no voicing contrast. We have a set of vowels, essentially in the typical kind of 5 vowel languages, but with short and vowel long counterparts, and also a series of diphthongs. So we are talking about a fairly small overall phonological inventory. In terms of prominence, this has been discussed in the earlier literature. However, there's been some disagreement about the rules. And in our work, we've been very much influenced by the work of Bickmore, who has probably written the most detailed exploration of main stress in Tahitian. It is essentially a quantity sensitive language. Main stress falls on final syllables if the syllable is heavy, but it is anti-penultimate or penultimate otherwise. And as a general rule, long vowels tend to attract stress unless they're in the vicinity of a final diphthong. And in that case, the final diphthong will have stress. You do also see variable accent placement on words for the short vowels. So I'm just going to play a few of these words for you. So we can see the stress shifts, obviously, in the last word there to follow the long vowel. So our first question then was, looking at the earlier literature, they describe stress, if you will, or word stress as accent d'intensité, so intensity accent, or accent tonique, a tonic accent. So I guess our interest was thinking about the overall post-lexical intonational typology of the language. So following Jun's methodology, we wondered if given that we have this sort of earlier description of the language as being a language with a quantity sensitive stress system, are we going to find that it has more like a head prominence, sort of an Englishy type intonational system where we seek out the main stress syllables of words to locate post-lexical intonational events or pitch accents, or are we going to find patterns more like an edge prominence language? So moving on, oops, sorry. It seems to be skipping on a bit too far, so I'm terribly sorry. I'll go back. So what do we find? We find that in terms of Tahitian prominence, we do very much find that looking at the intonational trajectories in one of our specific controlled sentence tasks where we did vary the placement of accent depending on Bickmore's stress rules, that the main pitch event, the main post-lexical intonational pitch accent does indeed seek out the stressed syllable, the main of the word. If this happens to be in non-final context, so the red signals here, the red panels indicate those post-lexical accents. The blue panels indicate the following unaccented syllables. We find that in phrase medial contexts, we get a penultimate late rising pitch pattern where the peak is timed to the second mora of an accented syllable. But when that word is phrase final, we find an earlier pitch rising pattern. So the peak is timed essentially to the first mora of the accented syllable due to making up room for the following edge tones, for example. We also find prosodic lengthening. Essentially, we have longer accented syllables here in red in both cases. So in the phrase medial or non-prepausal contexts, we certainly have a significant length difference between accented vowels and unaccented vowels. So we get some clear durational contrast, we get clear changes in intensity also, but essentially, because it's a quantity sensitive language, you're getting a lot of the durational heavy lifting because we are dealing with the quantity sensitivity of the language. It was not possible to to look at de-accentuation in a controlled way in this particular corpus, just because speakers did sort of tend to place each token in narrow focus, even in the sentence context when we tried to control for it. But we certainly have observed patterns of de-accentuation in our fable, or what we call our BES corpus, our Bizet-Soleil corpus. So moving on, our second question. We saw that the stop inventory is very small. We just have the bilabial, the denti-alveolar. So we decided we'd have a look at that. There's no voice in contrast, recall. So we were interested to see that given the smallness of the inventory, just two contrasting oral stops, no voice in contrast, would we see different kinds of variation? Now, why is this interesting? Well, for years now, I've looked at First Nations languages in the Australian context, and there's a group of languages that also have a single series stop series. But what we see in those languages is lots of variation in manner of articulation, depending on the context. So I was kind of interested to see what's going on in our data. Will we actually see similar kinds of allophonic variation to other single series languages, either in the Australian context or here? We've got an Algonquian language, Blackfoot, that was analysed by Jenny and Lee, and also closer to home, closer to Tahiti, Hawaiian, Davidson and Parker-Jones have also explored this issue. So what we see is absolutely resolutely, particularly in our control task, because this is where the data are from. It's from our very controlled task where we've contrasted all possible stops, vowels, and so forth. They're all voiceless, essentially all voices. There's no evidence of any kind of pre-voicing whatsoever in any of the contexts, either accented, unaccented, initial, or medial. They are very much short lag stops. So in other words, what we're seeing here are very, very short positive voice onset times of between 21 and 25 milliseconds. We do find a little bit of an effect of accent here. So again, the red corresponds to accent in the plot. The U, the unaccented, we've plotted word initial versus word medial stops in this case. So the only one where we really do find an effect of accent is in our alveolus, and indeed the VOT gets shorter, which is something that has been observed, I think, in particular for Blackfoot as well. So rather than longer, which is what you tend to get in languages like English, the effect of accent, the effect of post-lexical prominence in this case, is to indeed make it a little bit shorter. We do get segmental effects, however, particularly due to the following vowel, and VOT lag is significantly longer before close vowels, up to 20 milliseconds, but we're still talking about the shorter end of the voice onset time lag continuum. And this very much reflects the results also that were observed for Hawaiian by Davidson and Parker-Jones. Now, the rest of the talk, I want to focus on glottal stop variation, which is probably what we've worked on most. And we're rather interested to see then, again, thinking about this whole context of the stop inventory as well being small, but also thinking about the huge amount of work that people have done in recent years, looking very closely at glottal stop, creaky voice, and other sorts of things. And I know many people here in the room who've looked at these, but also I'd like to single out the work of Mark Garellek and colleagues, and also Christian de Cagno, among many others. So glottal stop is a very important consonant phoneme in Tahitian. It's called the eta. It has a very high text frequency. In Proto-Polynesian, it corresponded to a velar and a velar nasal. So these are no longer present in modern Tahitian, although certain loanwords, the velar plosive does show up, but it hasn't got a particularly high text frequency. Glottal stop can occur initially, medially, in stressed and unstressed syllable onsets. And there are also many minimal pairs where we find an initial glottal stop versus no glottal stop. They never occur word finally because essentially Tahitian has a fairly simple syllable structure, an open syllable structure, so there are no closed syllables. Now, looking back at the literature and the impressionistic descriptions, people talk about well, they don't agree essentially about what's going on. It ranges from there's no positional variation, that is, all glottal stops are voiceless in spoken Tahitian, or there's highly unpredictable variation. One thing that the authors do agree on is that there is co-articulation with surrounding vowels in words, particularly in those vowels that follow a glottal stop. So relevant, I think, very relevant to this is a little bit of a background. People talk quite often about the so-called continuum model of glottal stop production, where glottal stops can have realizations ranging from a creaky voice vowel to a fully occluded variant. So-called true glottal stops with full glottal closure are more likely to be found in word or phrase initial versus medial positions. So there's a sense in which you get a degree of prosodic strengthening or gestural strengthening in prosodically salient contexts. But in terms of just general variants, it seems that studies of other Polynesian languages, and particular Hawaiian, these studies suggest high levels of variation, ranging from canonical voiceless glottal stops through to creaky voiced stops, so the so-called fitting along the continuum, but they even note breathy voiced stops, or variants, should I say, and modal variants. So by the time we're getting into the breathy voiced and also the modal variants, we're kind of getting into the more vocalic territory as well. So lenition, essentially, I suspect, is going on when we see such variation. So just to play you a couple of examples of glottal stops from our corpus, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the data that went into the quantitative analyses that I'll present in the next slide. But just to kind of tune your ears in. Okay, so this was a word that cropped up rather a lot in our fable corpus, in our Bizet corpus for the southeast wind. And what we've got here on the left is an example of what Davidson has called the full glottal closure variant, and we certainly see that here looking at the speech waveform and the spectrogram. So we see a period of voicelessness, usually around 40 to 50% of voicelessness, but with some glottal pulses either side. Now, the second variant we've analysed as creaky voice, kind of hard sometimes because our speakers sometimes have quite a natural breathy voice anyway, but usually the creaky voice ones show up quite clearly. We can see the aperiodic striations going through the spectrogram here. And so this sort of allowed us then to, by looking across our corpus, we wanted to have a look at the distribution of different kinds of glottal variants following the protocols established by Lisa Davidson for Hawaiian. So we looked for evidence of full closure variants, creaky variants, breathy or modal voiced variants. And this is what we came up with. So I'll just tell you a little bit about the two tasks we looked at here. The two tasks we looked at were the controlled tasks that we looked at for the stops. Okay, but we also looked at our fable task, our bisocellary corpus. Now, if you focus just on the plots, here we've got the different kinds of variants plotted according to word position, so initial and medial, across the two tasks, just for ease of presentation. So we had across the corpus, this part of the corpus, around 2,263 glottal stops, and we found 4 main variants: a breathy voice variant, a creaky voice variant, a full closure variant, and modal voice. But by far, you can see by looking at the aqua bars in our bar charts and the green bars, the main variants were in fact full closure and creaky voice. And in fact, the modal variants were highly predictable because these either occurred at the beginning of particles or were in certain lexical items where flanking identical vowels. Okay, so there are some very, very specific lexical items where these modal variants occurred. But for the most part, we found 2 pretty consonantal variants, I would say, full closure and creaky voice. By creaky voice, essentially, what was absolutely striking to us was that it really resembled very much the aperiodic creak rather than the kind of vocal fry creak, which is a much more sort of vowel type creak that people like Pat Keating talk about. But what we did also find was word position was really important. So we saw more canonical glottal stops in word initial position or accented syllable onsets versus medial position. We ran particularly the two main variants, we ran that through a binomial logistic regression model, and it came up as highly significant. So we see more creaky voice variants and medial unaccented syllables. So we're assuming these are kind of our more lenited variants, given those prosodic contexts. And another sort of fact that was really interesting to us, that we actually saw a higher percentage of full closure variants compared to the corpus analysed by Davidson et al. Of course, we're looking at a very controlled sentence task and also a red task, whereas the data set that Davidson and Parker-Jones have analysed was a corpus of radio interviews from the 70s. So that the genre differences are probably responsible here. I won't have time to go through all of the various acoustic measures that we looked at, but I did want to show some. We looked at some of the measures in particular that were adopted by Mark Garellek and colleagues in their huge 131 language survey of glottal stop variation and other voice quality variation, moreover. So what we see here is strength of excitation. Here we see voicing fraction, which is the first one, and that's taken from the Pratt voice report. So essentially a lower degree of voicing or lower values of voicing equals less periodicity. We also looked at an intensity measure, again, a source measure looking at voicing intensity. So lower values equals less energy. So we used voice source in MATLAB. And we've recently also been using Pratt source for this. And finally, we extracted a spectral measure corrected for vowel sorry, I seem to have lost my. Apologies for that. There's always something, isn't there? So just picking up where I left off. Acoustic measures. Okay, so voiced fraction first. So we just decided to focus on the two main variants. Okay, here. So we've got the full closure variants on the left, the creaky voice variants on the right. Now the red here corresponds to the experimental task. So the red corresponds to the red speech or the connected speech fable task, the Bizet-Soleil. The blue bars correspond to a very controlled sentence frame task. The left panel in both cases is accented, the right panel unaccented, the top panel initial, the bottom panel medial. Well, just looking and comparing the two variants, it becomes obvious that there's a clear difference in voicing fraction looking at the full closure variants, which albeit had a few glottal pulsations. Okay, so that's why we're getting some signal being registered, compared to the creaky voice variants, where we see much more voicing fraction, particularly in the Bizet-Soleil task, so in the connected red task. So we found that glottal variant was highly significant, so lower degrees of voicing fraction in the full closure variants, as one might expect, higher degrees of voicing fraction in creaky voice variants. We found effects of prominence, and this was largely carried by unaccented syllables in medial position, essentially often having more voicing fraction. Initials tended to, particularly in our Bez task, had lower degrees compared to the medials, and so on and so forth. So essentially, again, higher voicing fraction here, meaning more periodicity, more creaky voice variants. So this seemed quite significant. Our intensity measure now, here we're looking just to change the color scheme to keep everyone awake. Here we have our purple bars now representing our Bizet-Soleil data, our yellow bars, the more controlled sentence frame data. And what we see, just glancing at the plots from left to right, they're arranged in exactly the same way. We get much higher levels of intensity in the creaky voice variants, as we would expect. So essentially they're noisier. The creaky variants are noisier, particularly in the Bizet-Soleil task. We also have a small effect of position, okay, in that we tend to get a bit more variation in medial position, but task was clearly the main indicator. So glottal variant and task were by far the strongest factors that affected our intensity levels. Now, the last measure I'm going to share with you today, because I'm already running out of time, is spectral tilt. And here we're not actually looking at the glottal variants themselves, we're looking at the vowels either side. And these were submitted to a GAMS analysis. But what I'm showing you here are the loose smooth signals, because I think it kind of makes it easier to see what's going on. So what we're looking at are vowels flanking glottal or oral stops. Okay, so the consonants are in the middle. You're looking at vowels that are preceding, vowels are following. In word initials, of course, there's no vowels preceding, and medials, there are vowels preceding, vowels following, and so on. So I'd like you just to note the fishtail pattern that's going on either side of the consonant here. And we see quite lower. So the solid line here represents our glottal stops, the dotted line, our oral stops that have been collapsed for this analysis. So we see lower spectral tilt values corrected for vowels leading in and out of our glottal stop. So this suggests, yes, we do have a degree of glottal co-articulation, as you would expect in the neighbouring vowels, which was predicted by those who have described glottal stops in the Tahitian literature to date. We also see effects of position, effects of experiment, effects of glottal type, and very small effects of prominence. Again, what we find is that the lowest spectral tilt values, remembering that low spectral tilt means higher levels of vocal fold constriction, so more creaky voice. We find this particularly in the medial unaccented vowels after a glottal stop, where we see more extensive creaky voice. So we're kind of seeing that very, very neatly here in this bottom right panel. So, in sum, yes, there is a degree of cross-linguistic similarity, thinking about what people have said about glottal stop variation across languages. We do get variation. We get evidence of full stop realizations. We get evidence of creaky voice realizations. To a certain extent, we're seeing some evidence of prosodic strengthening, particularly in accented initial context, particularly in our sentence frame task, but also we're seeing a lot of elenition in our medial unaccented context in the B's task, in the Bizet-Soleil task. We have a lower percent of creaky voice variance compared to Hawaiian, but we are dealing with a different language, a very different language context situation, and a very different genre. But it is also, we see lower degrees of creaky voice than have been observed in languages like Arapaho, which has been analysed by De Canio and colleagues. I would argue that certainly from what I've seen across our corpus, we have more consonantal, I would argue, rather than vocalic realizations. And even among those that we classified as creaky voice, you're getting more that look like aperiodic voice or prototypical creak with no periodicity or very intermittent periodicity compared to the vocal fry or tense voice, where we do get F0 being derived and so on. So the more sort of vowel end. We do see co-articulation also, particularly in our unaccented medial syllables. And of course, I've collapsed everything across our 6 speakers, and we do see a degree of interspeaker variation. But for the most part, there is some particular agreement in terms of the proportion of full stops realised compared to creaky voice variance, just slight differences in degree. So I just wanted to finish by saying that there's a lot of value in exploring low resource languages. Just because a language has a relatively simple phonological inventory doesn't preclude really interesting variation in the fine phonetic detail. And small languages do complicate things too. And I'd also like to signal that I really do think it's important for us to consider prosody and genre in phonetic typology. And I'll leave it there. Thank you so much again for inviting me. I'd like to acknowledge the work of my colleague Adele Gregory and also the research assistants Ben Volchok and Eleanor Lewis, who made this presentation possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you again for Professor Fletcher's inspiring talk. Yeah, let's give her another round of applause. So I'll now pass the time to Alex. So yeah, and to see whether there are any questions from the floor. Thanks.
Yeah, does anyone have questions for Janet?
Oh, hello, Marjana.
Yeah, hello.
Hi,
Hi.
how are you?
I just wanted to thank you for your wonderful talk. I really enjoy it. And I have a question regarding the short lag of T in stressed syllables. This is something counterintuitive, something that we don't find in other languages. How would you explain this?
Well, thank you, Marjana. Yes, I think it was interesting that my colleagues who worked on Hawaiian found something similar. And it's also been found in Blackfoot. And I think in a kind of way, it's sort of, it's just going, it's a strengthening effect, essentially. But I know that seems perverse to those of us that have worked on many other languages where we expect a lengthening. So we get longer closure, but we get shorter. And I think the thing is too, what's so interesting about these stops, I didn't have time to talk about them, is that there's often a glottal closure that's associated with them as well. So I suspect this is what's going on.
This is what I would assume. Maybe we see a kind of process from T to a glottal stop, and this would be a perfect example of a strengthening process, right?
I think that's right. And we see it in Marquesan also, which still has a velar, but the release is very glottalized. So I think, and it's other varieties have lost the velar entirely. So you can see this progress that's been going on through the languages.
Extremely interesting.
Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Janet.
Thank you so much, Janet. It was a lovely presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
One moment. Maybe I could ask
Yes,
Janet,
of course. Yes.
a small comment question. Thank you. I really enjoy your talk. And I remembered some experiments in Sweden a few years ago about the length. Swedish has substantial vowel lengths, short, long, and a little bit quality differences. But what we show, and I enjoy your analysis, Mora, which I think is not only a phonological thing, it is phonetic as well. Because what we show in Swedish, with modern analysis, we could see a lot, and not the old one, we couldn't see anything, was that the long vowels were two different things. One vowel here, something in between, and then another vowel when we had expansion. And tonal movements respected this boundary.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yes, I must
phonetic,
look into that.
Not only phonological.
Thank you.
And then we should probably have a look, what is the difference between two vowels, like in Greek, and then a long vowel with two muras. What is the realization?
Very good. That's a very interesting question. Thank you.
Maybe the long vowels is simply two vowels.
Indeed. Well, yes, yes. I think I better not start because I don't know. But yes, I think there's been some controversy in some of the other Eastern Polynesian languages, Marquesan, where that has indeed been a suggestion there.
And then it would be very interesting to have a look what is happening in the stressed syllabes and then in the unstressed syllabes.
Indeed.
How is the ratio if we have length distinction in unstressed syllable? What is the ratio? I mean,
yeah, no, and we certainly have those data, and we can certainly look at that. So thank you. That's a great suggestion.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And thank you again for the invitation.